Okay, welcome. This is part 4 of 5 of the lecture series on aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and monetary policy. So far, we've done aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now it's time to get the equilibrium. We get the equilibrium literally just by putting them together. It's about the easiest way we could go about doing this. So, anyways, we will be getting started on that. So, we've covered aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We did them separately. We did them separately because, well, it's generally good to kind of work through the math on one thing at a time. And then once you're done with that, you can put it all together. But in reality, right, what's happening in reality in these markets is they're happening simultaneously, right? Demand is being formulated by the market simultaneously with supply. So we have to think about these two guys in tandem. Demand and supply are endogenous to one another, and that means they're interrelated. They're interrelated, right? They're occurring simultaneously, and what happens to one is going to be affecting the other. So, kind of a big deal to look at them together, right? At least it seems like that to me, anyways. So, it means that we need to put AD and AS together, which is what we're going to do. Now, in your micro courses, when you covered supply and demand, you dealt with what's known as partial equilibrium. You looked at the equilibrium in like one particular market, maybe two, right? But you didn't look at like a bunch of them that were essentially closing out the entire economy. You'd look at like the market for guns and butter and be like, okay, well, if the price of guns goes up, what's going to happen to the demand for butter or something like that? But you weren't looking at all this other stuff. You're just looking at these two things, and the economy clearly does not exist of solely guns and butter. It's going to exist of a lot of other things as well. You look at the economy in terms of all of these other things, right? You now have a general equilibrium because when you affect one of the markets, it will create spillovers into all the other markets. And we could get into like the Walrasian modeling and all that. If any of you are interested, let me know. I'll be happy to make a video on Walrasian modeling. But at least for the purposes of this particular lecture, I don't really see the point in doing so. So the alternative to partial equilibrium is general equilibrium. So we just go ahead and make our quick salute to general equilibrium. And this occurs, like I said, when all markets are in equilibrium. And then we look at how the equilibria in these markets respond to a shock to, say, one single market, right? So let's say there's an increase in demand for solar panels. And if there's an increase in demand for solar panels, more solar panels are eventually going to be produced to satisfy this demand. But the economy's got a resource constraint, right? Like we can only make so much stuff. So if we make more of one thing, we have to make less of something else because it would be great if we could just make more of everything else. But absent a technology shock that would allow us to do that, well, we're kind of constrained. So hence our resource constraint. So if we make more solar panels, we're probably going to end up making fewer, let's say, gasoline generators or wind turbines, something like that, right? And in micro, when we're looking at this stuff, it's like we'll look at like markets for solar panels, markets for gasoline generators, wind turbines, markets for gasoline itself, right? Markets for electricity, markets for like the nuclear crap used for the power plants, all that stuff, right? And we'll like sort of put it all together. In macro, right, we don't really do it that way. Like we do general equilibrium in macro, but it's not like for each individual little like tiny market in the microeconomy that aggregates up to the macro. We don't really do it that way, right? We've got like GDP. GDP is like everything that's been produced, right? So it's kind of all put up into GDP, but then we'll have like how it's split up: consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, things like that, right? So in there, like you'll have investment market, like capital markets, right? You'll have those in there. You'll have money markets in there, for the monetary policy stuff. You will have um, stuff for like exchange rates in there, right? You'll have all sorts of like financial markets put in there. You'll have equity markets. So like, you could have like the S&P 500 as a proxy for the strength of equity markets, stuff like that, right? So generally speaking, we're only looking at like usually like 7 or 8 little things, and that's it. And we're looking at how they evolve over time. You impose a shock to one of them, and you see kind of how everything responds to a shock to one of these variables. So we're analyzing all the markets in the economy just like what we were in the micro case, but this is in the macro case. So the idea, the theory is exactly the same, but the application of the theory is a little different. So it goes without saying that we'll be covering general equilibrium here. Now, the equilibrium occurs when aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect with one another. So we really just do the easiest possible thing. We just take the graphs that we derived earlier and we just put them together. Now we're going to assume they intersect at the point where short-run aggregate supply equals long-run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. And that gives us a long-run equilibrium. If we were to be looking at, say, a short-run equilibrium, aggregate demand and aggregate or short-run aggregate supply would intersect, but they would not intersect at a point that crosses the long-run aggregate supply curve, right? So they're intersecting at a point that is not consistent with a long-run aggregate supply. Hence, it's a short-run equilibrium, not a long-run equilibrium. Now, in the short-run equilibrium, there are behaviors within the system that will allow convergence back to the long-run equilibrium, right? Like a short-run equilibrium is not inherently stable in the long run. It will eventually converge back to the long-run stable equilibrium. We can talk about how that works a little bit later. So, let's talk about the exogenous variables that will be the sources of shocks in the model. All right. These shocks are going to be causing the curves to shift, and thus they're going to be changing the equilibrium. For demand shocks, what we're going to have is, drum roll, please. IS shocks will be changes in A bar, C bar, I bar, T bar, G bar. It's supposed to be G with a bar over it when I was typing out the code in LaTeX. I guess I must have forgotten to do the little slash before the word bar. Therefore, it just kind of just said bar G, but it's supposed to be G with a bar over it. And NX bar, net exports. All right, monetary policy shocks will be changes in this R bar, right? Remember the autonomous monetary policy stuff, the monetary policy stuff that happens exogenous to the model, right? These are all exogenous variables. For supply shocks, what we're looking at would be changes in labor, capital, or technology. You change any of those. So when you look at the production function that we saw in the last lecture, right? Change labor, capital, or that source of technology shocks, that's going to be shifting potential output. It's going to be shifting your what's known as the flexible price equilibrium. Inflation shocks are going to come from changes in that variable rho. You can have expected inflation shocks, which are changes in expected inflation, right? So in that case, agents revise their inflationary expectations and they respond accordingly. Now, we're going to cover a little bit more on this stuff later, but just for now, these are the sources of shocks and these are the sides of the market that these shocks will be entering through. Boom. Here's the general equilibrium in the graph. Right? AD, AS, LRAS, they intersect at pi 0 and y0. This is it, right? This is the general equilibrium. Not too bad, right? I don't think so. So we looked at it graphically. Let's approach this analytically now. So analytically, right, we've got our short-run aggregate supply, which is this guy right here. Pi equals the expectation of pi, expected inflation, plus gamma times y minus yp plus rho. Aggregate demand is this, y equals 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times a bar minus d minus x over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times r bar plus lambda times pi. Right, so as you can see here, right, short run aggregate supply, prices in terms of output, aggregate demand, output in terms of prices. So we've got output and prices in each one. Now, if we want to get the equilibrium here, right, well, what we do is we want to solve for stuff. So I'm going to solve for what? What am I going to solve for here? Well, I'm going to solve for pi. So I'm going to take what y is equal to in equation 2. I'm going to plug that into y in equation 1. And that gives me this right here. Now, if you want to hit pause, see what I did, go for it, right? But literally all I did was just plug in the right-hand side of equation 2 into y in the parentheses there in equation 1. That's all I did. So, chug through it, solve for pi, you get this. You're like, wow, that's a lot. And yeah, it's a lot. That's like a lot. Now, once you have this, right, you can therefore get output y from the aggregate supply curve, because you can just plug all that crap for pi in, 2 pi in equation 4. You can solve it out for there, right? Okay, it's not bad. I mean, it's a lot of like kind of tedious math, but it's not too terribly bad. Then you can get r equals r bar plus lambda times pi and the components of output, should you so desire. Now, in reality, there needs to be time indexes on these variables. So when you looked at this, there's no time index, right? Some of these variables, right, the time varying variables, need to have time indexes on them. So how is that going to work? Because so far, all I've been doing is talking about this as a static system, but these guys change over time. And the points in time in which they exist matter quite a bit, because that's going to determine what happens in the future. So from here on out, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking at is we're going to have little subscripts, a t subscript, to indicate what point in time we're at for that variable. So a t subscript is indicating the present, today, right? If you see anything like x sub t or y sub t, right? Y sub t would be current output, right? Output today, GDP today. A t minus 1 subscript is for one period in the past, right? So it depends on what the frequency of the data is that we're analyzing, but let's assume that we're looking at monthly data, right? Because monthly data is generally what we use in macroeconomic analysis. If you've got, say, yt minus 1, right? Well, yt minus 1 is just what output was last month, okay? If it's quarterly, yt minus 1 would be last quarter's GDP. Things like that. A t plus 1 subscript is, you probably guessed it by this point, indicating one period in the future. All right, so yt plus 1 would be what output is going to be tomorrow. So, for example, right, pi t plus 1 was inflation one period ago. Whether it's 1 month ago, 1 quarter ago, 1 year ago, whatever the frequency of the data is, right, that t minus 1 is indicating you're literally just backing up one period. But pi sub t is current inflation. Now, in the case of these dynamic variables, right, these variables, these time-dependent variables, right, we've got the short-run aggregate supply curve as this right here. Pi t equals pi t minus 1 plus gamma times yt minus ytp plus rho t. Aggregate demand is this guy right here. Yt equals 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times a bar t minus d plus x over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times r bar t plus lambda pi t. Now, some of these guys have time subscripts. Some of them don't. The ones that don't have time subscripts are time invariant. They're constant, right? So whether you are looking at what they are today versus what they were last month, what they were a year ago, or 10 years ago, right? They're assumed to be the same. They will not be changing, right? These are time invariant parameters. They're constant over time. Now, the interesting stuff here is in the short-run aggregate supply equation. Because as pi t changes, the position of the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to change over time. Now, the adjustment occurs slowly, so you eventually reach YTP in response to a shock, but not like immediately after. It's not going to be like, the next day, or, oh, boom, we're right back there. It's going to take some time. Now, we're also going to be assuming that this rho t is generally equal to 0, right? So on average, because rho t has a distribution, right? Rho t is what's known as a random variable. It's got a distribution, it's got a mean, it's got variance. But the mean is 0. So on average, right? There are zero inflation shocks. Sometimes there are inflation shocks, sometimes there are not, but on average, there aren't any. So therefore, if you're trying to do any planning ahead within this model, you will plan ahead for rho t equals 0 because that's what it is on average. So we've got a dynamic equation in short-run aggregate supply. Dynamic because there's a variable that exists in two different time periods. We've got pi t, which is today, and pi t minus 1, which is yesterday. So what happened yesterday determines what happens today, and what happens today determines what happens tomorrow. How does what happens today determine what happens tomorrow? Well, let's just take that equation for short-run aggregate supply, and we update it one period, right? So what we're doing here is we are literally just adding 1 to every time subscript. So any time, like pi t or anything with a subscript t that you see, it's now t plus 1. Anything with a subscript t minus 1 becomes t, right? So pi t plus 1 equals pi t plus gamma times yt plus 1 minus yt plus 1 superscript p for potential output plus rho t plus 1. So what happened today is going to impact short-run aggregate supply tomorrow via that link between inflation today and inflation tomorrow. That's the way we can link these two equations together, right? Because I've got pi t plus 1 and I've got a pi t here, right? Well, if I back up a little bit and I look at this equation right here, that's pi t. All right, so if I wanted to, I could take the right-hand side of equation 5 and I could plug that in to pi t on the right-hand side of equation 7. Right, so there's this nice little like intertemporal link that says what happens today affects what happens tomorrow. And then, of course, what happens tomorrow is going to be affecting what happens the next day. And this all happens via the link between inflation today and inflation tomorrow. So, this was generally a pretty simple topic here that I wanted to cover. Nothing too crazy. Just kind of wanted to show you the graph for the general equilibrium and then what some of the algebra looks like in order to be able to solve. But yeah, we're going to wrap up here. So yeah, we just learned how to derive the equilibrium graphically and algebraically. Learned it in a static and dynamic framework. Dynamics the more important of the two. I'm going to tell you that right now. But as we get a little further into some dynamics, I'll ease you into it. It's not just going to be like, oh, blammo, here's a bunch of dynamics you guys got to do. You'll be able to kind of work your way up to it. So now that we've got the equilibrium, we can talk about shocks to that equilibrium and how they feed to the economic system. So yeah, till then, peace out.